computers can play chess and so on, that at some time in the future there will be this amazing thinking machine.
Well, it's fully conscious, like we are.
Well, then, of course, the question is, how do we decide whether it's fully conscious or not? And this, of course, gives philosophers... you can write many tons of books on this subject because it's hard to prove that even another person is conscious, let alone a machine. So there's so many philosophical problems here. There's enough mileage in this for philosophers to go on for centuries more arguing about these particular questions. But I just don't think it's a very fruitful or fertile debate. And I think the problem is, you see, that if you say that we're like computers, we're self-programming computers, you've still got the bit that does the programming. There's the computer model is inherently dualistic. The software is like the mind, the hardware is like the brain or the body. And it keeps landing on back in the same old Cartesian dualism in one way or another. I don't see that it takes us beyond it. And of course, the idea of thinking of the brain as a computer is just a way of trying to update the machine metaphor, to use the latest technology.
Well, Dennett wrote, for instance, the idea that the self or the soul is really just an abstraction strikes many people as a simple and negative idea, a denial rather than anything positive. But in fact, it has a lot going for it, including a somewhat more robustly conceived version of potential immortality than anything to be found in the traditional ideas of the soul. Abstractions.
Well, curiously enough, a lot of this computer thinking was started by Alan Turing, the British mathematician during the war. He began to develop these ideas about computing systems, and he laid the foundations of modern computing theory. Now, it's very interesting that Turing was motivated by a desire to prove the immortality of the soul. Turing was homosexual. His dearest friend, when he was at school, died at the age of about 18. And he was obsessed with in what sense his friend could be said to survive the death of the body. And he came to the idea that if the self was nothing but a kind of logical structure of abstractions, of the kind that you can put as a program in a computer, then you can take this program from one computer to another, and this, you can have a kind of immortality of this system of abstractions that's independent of the physical base in which it's realized in the form of computers. So there's a sense in which this dualism of body and soul, or program and machine, which is present in the computer metaphor, and which Dennett may be alluding to, was built in right at the very beginning by Alan Turing, and one could even say that this was part of his motivation for doing it. It was to find a way of proving a kind of immortality without having God or anything to do with traditional religion. It was to find a kind of abstract mathematical basis for a sort of abstract immortality.
All the people we film in Friendly Hampstead in London will be dead in 100 years' time. But in North Andover, in the USA, Daniel Dennett explains patiently that this may not always necessarily be the case. The illusion of immortality, which all religion has always proclaimed, can, in principle, be replaced by true immortality. I have no idea what the confrontation of Sheldrake and Dennett will bring. This lady, 150 yards away from Sheldrake's house, what exactly is she painting? Is she painting what is there, or what should have been there? Again, I quote Stephen Jay Gould to Sheldrake. Gould, who writes that nature is non-moral, that nature offers no ethic to support us. If we need morality, we have to seek for it inside ourselves.
Well, I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about questions of morality,
okay.
And so it's not.
But you're dealing with it every day.
Yes.
You're making everyday choices about morality.
Oh yes, I mean I'm interested in the whole subject, but I mean I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about how it relates to the uniquely human. You see, the thing is, a lot of secular humanists are very much into this speciesist thing. They have to prove that human beings are radically different from everything else in nature, and the usual things they use are consciousness and morality. These are, or tool making,
free will,
machine making. Well, these are the standard arguments, and they're used, of course, to justify the fact that it's wrong to kill people, but it's all right to kill cows to make hamburgers, or battery chickens to have Kentucky Fried Chicken. You've got to have some kind of justification for the way we behave. So I would say, though, that if you look at the natural world, that most of the things we think of as moral features are things that we can find pre-shadowed in many ways in the natural world. For example, parental care and affection, which are a basic aspect of responsibility. Moral responsibility towards children is a key part of all human societies. And when you look at the behavior of birds looking after their young, and animals in general, and the way they care for their young and raise them, you could say that here we see maybe an unconscious or instinctive, but we certainly see the principles of parental care and responsibility at work.
But when you're looking at caterpillars eating their own parents, then you can say, well, here we are back again with Darwin in this cruel, horribly cruel world.
Well,
it's where you're looking at.
Well, I mean, I don't know whether more caterpillars eat their parents than people kill other people. I mean, if you look at human wars, it's not a very impressive record for human beings being distinctly better than other animals in terms of not killing each other. In fact, I'd say we're probably worse than most in terms of our record in killing members of our own species. I think the problem, you see, is to take the moral as the distinctively human, is to take a theoretical argument. It's to fall into a kind of narcissism where we look at an idealized reflection of ourselves. If you look at the reality of human behavior, then you find brutal massacre and killing of members of our own species is part of what people have done for a long time, and the so-called modern civilized world has done more of it than most. And the recent Iraq war showed, it was considered perfectly all right to massacre with weapons of mass destruction tens of thousands of retreating soldiers. Things that in the past would have been considered inconceivably brutal are now considered perfectly normal. And so there's no growth of morality, it seems to me, with the advance of technological civilization. And if you look at the actual practice of human beings, and you look at, do human beings on average kill each other more or less than the members of other species? The answer is, I think they kill each other more than the members of most other species do.
Look, for instance, in the wolves.
Yes, and or look at it's very rare to find animals killing other members of their own species. But it's quite common to find human beings doing it, and modern civilized societies like our own are still, in Britain, still building weapons of mass destruction. Enormous increase going on at present in British nuclear armaments. Why? I mean, the capacity to destroy hundreds of millions of people, considered perfectly normal. In fact, it's being expanded. So I find the morality argument as a kind of species badge of honor not a very strong one. I mean, it's certainly the case that human beings...
But morality would make us unique.
Well, the trouble is that morality, as conceived by Enlightenment philosophers, seems to me a kind of abstraction. If you look at morality as practiced in traditional societies, it's not usually elevated into some enormous moral code. It's more in the question of custom or habit. And that, I think, is the natural state of human morality, and it's closer to the kind of implicit behavioral norms that we find in animal societies. Bees, wasps, ants, flocks of birds, all of them have ways of cooperating together. That means that the individual members of the society work together, usually fairly harmoniously, in a way that's mutually beneficial. And this we find in human societies. We're social animals, and as such, we find that our societies are influenced by social bonds and social norms, like any other social animal. We make it conscious, and we elevate it into the name of morality. But the word morality is quite a recent invention. I mean, in traditional human societies, the word morality isn't exactly used in our modern sense. There are certain norms of behavior. You don't do certain kinds of things, and you can do other kinds of things. And if you do things that are prohibited, you're ultimately expelled from the society in one way or another. But I think this abstract notion of morality is not very helpful. That's my own feeling. The purpose of an individual in a traditional society is to live in accordance with the myths of the way the ancestors have lived. Innovation is not particularly relevant. In fact, it's a way of deviating from an established path that's been followed many times before.
Dangerous.
It's dangerous. Whereas our society has put a great emphasis on innovation and has correspondingly weakened the sense of following ancestral paths and customs, and therefore gives the sense that each new generation is somehow better, wiser, cleverer than the last. So our societies are full of problems of adolescent rebellion. You don't get this in traditional societies because each generation now has to prove itself better, cleverer, more advanced than the last. And so this lack of rooting in tradition creates conditions where innovation can happen more readily, and that in turn weakens the influence of the past. And so our societies are evolving with a dissolution of the old social structures, hurtling into the future in a way that nobody can foresee where it's leading. The dissolution of traditional morality and traditional social and family patterns is something that's happening far faster than I think anyone imagined in the past, and will leave us with a kind of society that no one can really envisage in the future. I mean, if families fragment, if more and more children grow up outside the normal socializing influence of the family. Now in Britain, 25% of children are now being raised by single parents, mostly single mothers. In northern England, over 50% of children are now being born to parents who are not married, to mothers who are not married. And so the traditional family system is breaking down, and nobody has any idea, it's never happened before, what happens to society if the principal socializing influences on children are no longer present. And yet this is a logical outcome of the dissolution of all traditional forms of social order. And I don't think it's leading anywhere that most people would welcome or look forward to.
What do you expect?
Well, I don't know. I think that it's very hard to envisage how a society can be changed when many people within it lack the basic elements of socialization, of being brought within social forms, constraints and customs. And I think this is the problem of inner cities in the United States, where there's now large areas which are full with what they talk of as a kind of unmanageable underclass that may not be possible to incorporate within the kind of consensus pattern of liberal democracy. Depends on individuals being strongly motivated morally through traditions. But if those traditions that sustain the individuals dissolve, the state, the liberal state itself, tries to be neutral. It's based on the model of science. It's based on a kind of scientific norm. The state is a technocratic structure to bring about services in a morally neutral manner, following the idea that in science you can separate values and facts. And so promoting the idea of tolerance of different social groups, but the state can itself give no cultural norms to people within it. And therefore, liberal states live on the capital of the past in terms of the religious teachings of the Jewish and the Christian and other religious traditions. As those break down, then there's nothing to take their place. And it's very doubtful that this kind of society can survive for very long, in my opinion. I think if we just have an extrapolation of present trends, dissolution of the social order, rising population in the third world, exhaustion of resources, pollution of the planet, destruction of long-term reserves of everything in terms of short-term consumption, then we'll see a collapse, at least, of our civilization and the present political and social order, massive famine, appalling disasters, in fact, a kind of apocalyptic scenario of destruction. And it may not be uniformly spread. I mean, there may be places in the world where you hardly know it's going on. Just read about it in the newspapers. As it is indeed at present. There are terrible things happening in Africa with famines and civil wars, but they hardly touch us. So it may be that things will start falling apart in Africa and in other parts of the world, while people in Western Europe may go on quite comfortably for a bit longer. But I don't think we can be insulated forever from these things. And so I think the present order is doomed, but what will take its place is not at all clear to me. Whether we'll have whether the present kind of system, the present kind of state, has the ability to reform itself.
Or is delivered to chaos.
Well, chaos
Totally
doesn't
chaos.
usually last long. I mean,
No.
people don't like chaos. Like in Russia, they don't like chaos, and they've got chaos now. So it's only a matter of time before you have kind of neo-fascist dictatorships springing up, I suppose.
In one of your books you had a quotation from Jacques Monod.
Mm-hmm.
I'll read it. Man must at last wake out of his millenary dream and discover his total solitude, his fundamental isolation. He must realize that, like a gypsy, he lives on the boundaries of an alien world, a world that is deaf to his music and as indifferent to his hopes as it is to his sufferings and his crimes. Why did you quote him?
Well, because Monod represents very clearly and puts very explicitly the natural outcome of a kind of mechanistic, materialistic view of nature and of humanity. This is the natural outcome. Most people don't think it through to its logical conclusion, but if you do, this is the logical conclusion. This is the development of the movement started by Galileo and Descartes, which has now worked itself out in our society and indeed has been exported to the rest of the world as a view of reality. Those are its consequences. And Monod just makes them very clear and very explicit. I quoted it because he does so with such clarity.
We have to wake up from our 1,000 years dream and come to terms with our existential loneliness. The world is as deaf to our music and as indifferent to our illusions as it is to our suffering and our crimes. Pleasant neighborhood, Hampstead. The people are friendly and polite. The best anticipation machines, Daniel Dennett calls them. The best denial machines, Rupert Sheldrake calls them. Every day we can see that we are preparing for disaster, but we back away and turn a blind eye. What we've got now is obviously more important than what we'll be missing tomorrow. A bizarre invention is what Stephen Jay Gould calls people. We mustn't think that our consciousness was an intentional creation only because it's so powerful. Our tape does not follow the paths of logic. Sheldrake has spoken his epilogue, "The present order is doomed," before we've even touched upon his ideas, his revolutionary ideas about evolution and consciousness. How we, our society, possibly end up is painfully obvious. But how did we get here? In that question lies the essence of Sheldrake's controversial theory. As if we are starting all over again, we return to that question.
Get up and dance. Get up and dance. Come on, don't be afraid. Get up. Dance. Let the world be a stage. Dance in the rhythm of life. Come on, get up and dance. Come on and dance. Don't be afraid. Come on, move. Get up. Do your thing. Dance. Dance. Dance in the rhythm of life. Come on. Move. Yeah. Dance. 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 Let the world be a stage. Dance in the rhythm of life. Move.
Genetically and physically, We are all more or less the same, said Oliver Sacks in New York. But as a narrator, each of us is unique. We are nothing else but storytellers, Daniel Dennett will say in Noord and Over. Narratives form our consciousness, not our consciousness, the narratives. Sheldrake's approach is different. We are built up of memories of our own life, but also of the life long before we were born. Those memories form our narratives and, finally, our consciousness. And this is all very well and fine with me. But what does Sheldrake mean by memories? What memories do we consist of? What stories did we know even before we came from the womb? Or, according to Sheldrake, from before we were even conceived? That question is at the basis of all his theories. As a start, I ask him where our memories are stored.
Well, I think that where's the wrong question. Memory is a phenomenon of relation in time. And when we see that memory is principally to do with the interrelation of events in time, it's not immediately obvious that the question where plays much part in this. You see, where is memory stored immediately traps us in a whole set of spatial metaphors, and the problem is that we think of time in terms of spatial metaphors, the near future, the distant past. And so people think, well, there must be a memory store. So where is the memory store? Is it in the brain? Is it in the Akashic records, as the Theosophists would say, in some kind of ethereal realm beyond the normal realm? But all of these are ways of trying to find a place for memory. Well, I don't think it is in a place. I think it's a relation in time. I don't think it's stored in the brain, you see. I think we tune into our memories, that we directly tune into them involving a kind of transmission in time. This is a key part of my particular theory of morphic resonance. So memories are not exactly in places. I think that the past is potentially present everywhere, and that through similarity or whatever we then tune into or access aspects of past experience. But it's not, in the meantime, stored anywhere in particular.
Penfield did some experiments. You wrote about it. What did his experiments prove?
Penfield did some experiments where he stimulated the lobes, the temporal lobes of the brain of epileptic patients. And he found that when he stimulated them electrically in certain places, they had vivid flashes of memory. Now, we don't know they were actual memories. They may have been hallucinations, but they seemed like memories, and he assumed they really were. Let's assume they were. But his first conclusion was that this proves the memories are stored in the part of the brain he'd stimulated, which he called the memory cortex. In his last book, called The Mystery of the Mind, Penfield discarded his own earlier interpretation. He gave up the idea that memories were stored in the temporal lobes, or indeed anywhere else in the brain in particular places, and came round to the view that memories were curiously diffuse, that you couldn't localize them in particular places. In fact, in his last book, Penfield became a dualist, a kind of Cartesian dualist. So he saw the mind interacting with the brain, and he no longer felt the need to have a brain location for every kind of mental function. So my own view, you see, would be that the brain is more like a TV receiver than a video recorder, that you tune into yourself in the past as a kind of transmission through time by what I call morphic resonance from the past to the present.
Before entering morphic resonance and your hypothesis of formative causation, just remembering, Freud stated, where is it? Prehistoric times have found their psychic repercussions in the heritage that in each generation only needs to be revived, not acquired. Children in many ways do not react according to their own experiences, but according to instinct comparable to animals, in a way that can only be explained by assuming that they have phylogenetic knowledge at their disposal. when I talk with Oliver Sacks, and he also writes about this, he is talking about pre-human memories that go back to the darkest corners of existence, and that providing his patients with images from the prehistoric and pre-human landscape. How familiar does that sound to you, this phylogenetic memory, the pre-human landscape we are living in, and although we are living now?
Well, it sounds entirely familiar to me. I think that we inherit a great deal of collective memory from our ancestors, and I think it goes back a long, long way. Some kinds of things go back further than others, but, for example, the experience of a child on its mother's breast, a very fundamental experience very early in life, is I would say, in resonance with the experience of young mammals sucking from breasts, for 60, maybe 100 million years of mammalian history, that there's not much difference between a human baby sucking at a breast and a piglet sucking at a breast, or any other mammal sucking at a breast. And this has been the defining characteristic of mammals ever since the mammals first evolved. So there's something in this which many of us have had, or those who haven't have sucked at bottles which are breast substitutes, that involves utterly fundamental experience which is so similar to that of phylogenetic memory going back many, many millions of years that I think it would almost inevitably invoke or be related to this long, long series of memories.
But Sacks is talking about pre-human landscapes.
Well, so am I. The mammals are pre-human. They go back 60...
even pre-mammal landscapes, even pre-dinosaur landscape. You understand what I mean?
Well, yes. I'm not quite sure what kind of experience he might be referring to. I think that for many people, psychedelic visions, for example, people who take psychedelics and see astonishing visionary states, often describe things that could be regarded as pre-human. The psychologist Stan Grof, who's studied the effects of LSD on many, many people, has collected the stories they've told, and he's been driven to the conclusion that this is a particularly effective way of evoking a kind of pre-human memories, which normally would be suppressed. Most of us would spend a lot of time suppressing these archaic memories. They wouldn't come out in ordinary everyday life. They might come out in dreams, but we might then forget them. But in certain unusual and altered states of consciousness, they may become clearer. But the vast majority of that memory is unconscious, just as the great majority of our own memory is unconscious. Most of us can't remember how we developed inside our mother's womb. Most of us can't remember almost anything that happened in the first few years of our lives. And if we can't remember even our own ordinary personal